A new poll from Abacus data shows 72% of Canadians think the 3-year carbon tax carve-out for home heating oil should be expanded to cover all home heating fuel. When you look at the breakdowns from that poll, a majority of all main parties want to see future exemptions on all types of home heating fuels like propane and natural gas, with Conservative supporters most in favour at 85%, and Liberals, they're also at 62%. That's an interesting number. Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre promised yesterday to ramp up pressure on the government to pass another bill that would give farmers a tax break.
Common sense Conservatives are launching a full-on campaign to push for Liberal senators to allow the passage of C-234 to take the carbon tax off farmers and food.
Who's winning the political battle over the carbon tax? It's time to bring in the Power Panel. Shachi Kurl is the president of the Angus Reid Institute. Françoise Boivin is a former NDP MP and political commentator. And here with me in studio, Stevie O'Brien is a senior advisor at McMillan Vantage, and Kate Harrison is vice chair at Summa Strategies. So Stevie, I'm going to start with you. Interesting numbers this morning from Abacus data. They're finding that 62% of Liberal voters, at least the respondents to this poll, think that the carbon tax pause should be expanded to include all energy sources. What do you make of some of this numbers that we're getting?
It's not surprising that it's easy to sell a tax cut during an affordability crisis. But what I'd say is the heating oil announcement a couple weeks ago, primarily and most disappointingly, was a communications error. And what it has given the premiers and the opposition another sort of tool to, or another stick to hit the government with, this cry of inequity. And the federal government's being unfair, which in fact isn't actually true. Of the 1.2 million houses that have that use heating oil, 900,000 are west of Nova Scotia. So I really hope the Liberal government pushes back on that narrative of inequity. Of course, though, it's harder when you have to sort of explain the science behind why heating oil and propane are different versus just putting axe the tax on a bumper sticker.
Yeah, I think probably because when the Prime Minister made the announcement about the pause, he was just surrounded by Atlantic Canadian MPs, so it sort of signaled from the get-go that maybe this was an announcement that would benefit just that region. But as you rightly point out, there are people across the country who use home heating oil. It's a small percentage in provinces like Ontario and Quebec, but a small percentage of a much larger population, right? And so people will be able to benefit from this. But what do you think, Kate, where do you think this goes? Because it does seem like it's really difficult to keep pressing on with a policy that voters perceive to be unfair. Whether it is unfair or not, there is obviously a lot of support in this poll and others for there to be an expansion of the carbon tax, an expansion of the pause that was put in place. Do you think that that's something we'll see from this government? Do you think they're willing to walk back kind of a signature policy that they've been championing for the last 8 years?
I don't, and to your point, it's because it's a signature policy that we probably won't see that window expand. I think if you were to ask Abacus data, open-ended to Canadians, what do they view as this government's major hallmark policies? I think one would be legalizing marijuana, and I think close behind it would be the climate change agenda and progress on environmental issues, an issue which the Liberals still own in the minds of voters. So to expand this carbon tax carve-out, JP, would really undermine that foundation that the Liberals have built on this issue. And to Stevie's point on execution, it's failed in a couple of different ways. Certainly, they've not been able to win the political constituency they were trying to in terms of shoring up more support in Atlantic Canada. I think they've hurt themselves quite a bit with, I'll say, terracotta Liberals, those that might go back and forth between the Orange team and the Red team. And all they've done is really hand Pierre Poilievre another opportunity to lean on the critique of this government that they're sowing regional divisions with adoptions of policies like this.
Françoise, 62% of Liberals want to see an expansion of the carbon tax pause. They want to see it applied to all energy sources. They don't just want it on home heating oil. And then we also I want to read you something from Saskatchewan Premier Scott Moe, who has a new statement out today. He's really putting pressure on the Senate to pass another legislation, as he says it is unacceptable that the Senate would stand in the way of providing Canadians with a break on grocery costs by blocking this carbon tax exemption, which has been approved by the House of Commons. He's talking about some delay tactics that were used by some Trudeau-appointed senators in the upper house last week, trying to punt debate on this bill, putting it off to another date, probably when they return next week. But what do you make of this concerted effort? Clearly, Pierre Poilievre and his ally, in many respects, the Saskatchewan Premier, are really trying to ramp up the pressure on the government and trying to poke holes, try to make the climate policy of this government into Swiss cheese, basically.
Well, exactly. And maybe because the message from the Conservative side is easier to understand for the population than the one that the government is trying to convey. A lot of people from the get-go don't get what the carbon tax is all about, what it does, and then you get a check, and meanwhile our emissions still are not going to reach their targets, and so on and so forth. And then you have Pierre Poilievre who comes up and say, we're all hurting. Everybody is hurting in Canada. It's going to cost a lot of money to heat ourselves this winter. We should cut everything for everybody. And the government, who, like Stevie was saying, did a really bad job of communicating what they were trying to do with this. So to add the pressure, and then it's on food, it's on farm. Let's remove that tax, which seems to make sense. I mean, and poll anybody. Shashi will tell us. Ask anybody on the phone, would you like to see that tax go? And I'll raise my hand also. I mean, everybody will say, yes, please remove all taxes if we can. Now, how we get the service and how we do this and that, that's another story. But it depends what the question is. So they are in a bad situation, especially since the House did adopt C-234. And now it's gamemanship being played in the Senate. So they're just joining in the bandwagon. So the poor Liberals are cornered in that, and with an environment minister who said no more, or I'm stepping down. So that. We'll see if we still have the same environmental minister in a few weeks.
Yeah, Environment Minister Stephen Guilbeault was out today saying that Pierre Poilievre and the Conservatives are being disingenuous about this bill that is before the Senate that would exempt more fuels from the carbon tax for farmers alone. He says that most fuels that farmers use are already exempt from the carbon tax, and that there is a rebate program in place where some farmers can get back some cash, just like consumers do when we fill up our cars. Although it is quite onerous for some farmers, not everyone is able to tap into some of these programs and have their fuel sources covered. $31,000, for example, is a fuel bill for a chicken farmer. I was speaking to one person about that for a single year. It's a huge expense. Shachi, do you think the government is in a bind here? Like, where do they go from here? I mean, they do want to be the climate warrior party, right? And they have been so steadfast about that for 8 years. They keep hammering Poilievre about saying, where's your policy? You have nothing to offer on climate. We're facing all these natural disasters, and yet you come up with nothing. That's their claim. Do you think that voters right now are willing to pay a little more to maybe deal with climate change? Or do you think there's going to be this momentum to try and scrap this policy?
Well, it depends on which voters and the extent to which voters understand whether the amount that they're paying in tax is equal to, less than, or more than the amount that they're getting back in rebate. And you know, this poll today really does a very good job of explaining the what, okay? So what people want, or what they're saying they want, is they'd like to see some tax relief too. Where's my tax relief? And I talked about this in my column on Friday for the Ottawa Citizen, talked about it on the House on Saturday morning when the Environment Minister was also on, saying that he would absolutely not be going anywhere. I'm paraphrasing. I don't think he used exactly those words. But the point is, what we need to better understand now is the how. Okay, so what is driving those views? What is it predicated on? And for a party that has liked to pride itself so much on its climate leadership, Stevie talked a little bit about this just a moment ago when she talks about the fact that the rollout was perhaps not well explained. Françoise also talks about the communications gap. Here's where the Liberals have really just failed to do the daily homework. You know, the old adages about like make your bed every day or brush your teeth every day, like do the healthy habits. Here's where the Liberals have not. Over the 8 years that they've had to do this and hammer this into the brains of every household taxpayer out there, that for those that are getting rebates, here's your money back. Like, critics hate it and journalists hate it when politicians, put up those big garish billboards and like to really burnish their creds and tell you when they're giving you a break or giving you a money back or doing something nice for you. I remember those infrastructure spending dollars after the financial crisis in the mid to late 2000s. Those aught decades where the Harper government had all of those billboards, your tax dollars at work. Where is like the laminated check and the special glossy insert that comes with that saying, look at how much you're getting back. Oh, and by the way, aren't you virtuous? You're helping combat climate change. You're helping bend back emissions. This government over the better part of a decade has taken it for granted that broadly, with the exception of some opponents and some absolute haters of this taxation, that everybody else got it and understood it. And what they are realizing in this moment is in the face of a cost of living crisis, which is felt so much more individually at the household level, people are equating that tax pain with the pain that they are feeling due to higher cost of living, and it's never been adequately explained or communicated to them that maybe that's not the case. So we really have to understand what support for this looks like by understanding of who's getting a rebate, and stay tuned for data on that.
Stevie, I want to give you the last word on this because I feel like folks have been beating up on the government here, but do you think that there is a chance that the carbon tax just goes away? Because, we have the home heating oil exemption. There is increasing pressure from the premiers to do it nationwide on all heating oil sources. We now have the Senate bill. Is there a chance they just abandon the carbon tax and maybe just bolster other carbon policies, other climate initiatives, maybe just dismantle that and put more money into a more ambitious heat pump program, for example, make other activities that would help us?
The carbon tax isn't going anywhere. It is a signature piece of policy. We've discussed that already this evening. I think the next election is probably going to be a climate change focused election. What we're going to see, and maybe even as early as next week, are additional measures that do focus on affordability, that focus on housing, that focus on those top voter issues that do not necessarily or do not touch carbon pricing at all.